Welcome everyone to our second Storytale Vestal event of 2021, and we're delighted to have Pridie back with us. Last year she captivated us with her telling of the beekeeper and the hare from the bottom of her garden in Bristol. This year she's on her farm in Wales for a special outdoor storytelling of the Nettle princess. There's a beautiful view just behind her of the mountains as well. We've been very jealous looking at it. We'll pop Pridie's The Wild of the Words Facebook page in the comments and a few other links after the story. But you also might like to keep an eye out for Pridie's. You've got some storytelling and bushcraft events coming up next season at your farm campsite. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
And are they going to be online, or are they going to be in-person events, or a combination of both?
So they are going to be in-person events, and all the information will be on my website, Kate. Yeah. So all the information for the beginning of next year, in winter time, probably, to make us all start feeling excited about spring.
Yes, that sounds fabulous, and we'll share those links then as well, and share your website. And just before we hand over to Pridie for her story, for anybody who's watching, we're running a giveaway with two beautiful picture books by Lauren and Will, who are two of our event hosts this year. And to be in with the chance of winning, just say hello to us in the comments, ask Pridie a question, just say hello to us, and we'll automatically add you in to the giveaway, which I think we'll be announcing the winners on Monday. I'm delighted to hand over to Pridie and the Nettle Princess.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you so much, Storytale Festival, for having me again. It's really lovely to be back outside and telling some stories. And it doesn't matter that it's online. We learned that, didn't we, over lockdown, that it doesn't matter if it's online, because you can still feel connected, especially when you've got this comment thing that goes on when you're live. So if people want to ping me any comments, then they absolutely can. And I can give you the best answer I can possibly gather together. So I am with you today because I would like to share a story. I want to share a story that's about a very special plant and a princess and a prince and a castle and a word and everything you would expect in a fairy tale. But most of my work, if not all of my work, is directed towards helping people to, well, I guess, better connect with the outdoors. And you connect by understanding stuff, right? So if I say to you, what's a nettle? And you think to me, oh, I don't know, I can't remember what it looks like. My plan is that by the end of this story, you will know what a nettle looks like, and you'll know something about the nettle. And you'll even hopefully want to rush off and tell everybody else a story that you just learned about the nettle itself. Because if we know about these plants and trees and creatures, then we can help protect and preserve them. And the best way to get to know them is through a story. So without any further ado, I better share one with you. This story is quite old. Originally, it was called The Tale of Maid Maleen, and it was recorded by the Grimm's brothers over 100 years ago. There's a more modern version of it in one of the books that my girls have. Absolutely fantastic book by Kate Pankhurst, and in it she calls the story The Nettle Princess. So my story today is going to be a sort of combination of both of those tellings that me and my girls love. It starts, as every good story starts, a long time ago. But you know what? I'm not going to get hung up on telling my tale in that oldie worldy kind of way, because I want you to feel like you could tell the story as well. So I'm going to tell this tale in a style, well, that's a bit gossipy, I guess, because that's the best way to tell a tale. We're all really good gossips, and people remember a story if it sounds like we've gossiped it to begin with. So let me tell you this story. It did happen a long time ago, and it involves two castles high up on the mountains. Mountains much like the one behind me here. There was a great castle on one of the mountains to the left-hand side, and there was another great castle on the other mountain to the right-hand side. And these castles had kings in them. Kings that didn't like each other. And several times throughout the year, they would send their armies streaming down the hills, and they would give battle, and they would fight, and lots of people would get hurt. And at the end of the battle, they'd walk their way back up, limping, injured, to their hills and their castles, and they'd hide away again. Now, this would go on and on and on, and it was like they couldn't find any way to reconcile themselves. It was as if they just had to go on fighting. But there were two young people who didn't like what was going on, and they didn't want to fight. In one of the castles, there lived a princess called Malene, and in the other castle, there lived a prince called Hans. Now, between these battles, this young prince and this young princess used to sneak away from their castles. And further down at the bottom of the valley, between the two mountains, was a wood. In fact, not just a wood, but a great wild forest that was huge and beautiful. It was where the squirrels would scamper, and the deer would dart between the glades. And there was lots of bird song, and great long shafts of sunlight would come floating through the canopy of the trees. Now, these two young people would go and spend their time whenever they could together in the forest. They would sit together and talk, and they would ask each other why their families insisted on being such bitter enemies. And neither of them could even remember how the fighting had begun centuries ago. The history itself had been lost. They decided that they should always remain the best of friends, not bitter enemies. And they loved each other dearly. And they promised each other that this forest would always be their special kingdom, and that whatever happened, they would always try to come down here and sit with their backs to the trees, amongst the nettles and the plants and the trees in the forest, and spend time together, not fighting, but being happy. Hans would laugh, and he'd often say, "I'm going to call you my Nettle princess." And that was because Malene absolutely loved nettles. She would take them home when they were young in the spring, and she would make them into delicious soups or make tea with them. She was very clever, knew how to spin nettles into clothes. She was always very healthy because nettles, of course, contain lots of vitamins like vitamin C and good nutrients for you. So she had rosy red cheeks and was in the best of health, happy and fit, and hopping about whenever they visited the forest. Now, one day, that happy time seemed like it was going to come to an end, because her father called her to the hall, and he presented to her his richest, most powerful knight. And he said, "Daughter of mine, I found you a husband." "A husband?" said Malene. "A husband? Yes, a husband," said her father. "You shall marry, and I shall be rich, and you will be rich, for this knight will bring much with him, and you will be happy and go off and live in the castle just down the hill." "I can't, father," she said. I can't do this. I can't do this. I don't want to be part of all the fighting anymore. I don't want to marry this knight who I don't love. I don't want to do it. I love another. I love Hans." It was totally silent in the hall. You could have heard a pin drop, and nobody was smiling. Her father took a while to pull himself together, but when he did, his face went red as a beetroot. "You love who?" he said. "I love another," Maid Malene answered. "I love another, father, and though I love you, I cannot marry your knight." The king flatly refused to have anybody not do as he was asking. And that included his daughter. "Let me ask you one more time, and let me tell you one more time," he said, "and your answer will be the final one. Did you say you won't marry my knight?" Maid Malene drew herself up. tall, and she didn't feel very brave or strong, but as strong and brave as she could possibly look. And she answered her father, and she said, "No, I cannot marry this night. I love another, and I wish to be with him." Her father sent for the guards. Her father ordered that a great tower be built just down the hill. Her father then told Maid Maleen that she was to be locked up in that tower for 7 long years, with enough food and water to drink and eat while she was in there, and a maid to keep her company. But if she had not changed her mind by the end of those 7 long years, she would stay in there forever. She cried, and he cried. And goodness knows why he was insisting on doing this, but he was the king, and back then he felt like if his orders weren't performed, if his orders weren't followed, then that person needed punishing. So Maid Maleen, his own daughter, was dragged from that hall and placed in a tower that had a great long turret that sort of speared the sky above, and it was grey and built of the thickest stone. It wasn't a very nice place to go. And she was placed in there with her maid, and she watched the soldiers bring in cartloads of food and water, enough to keep her with food and water for 7 years. And then she and her maid had to watch them brick up the entrance to the tower. There was no light in there. It was dark. At least they had company. And for a long while they cried because they'd lost the light, they'd lost the sun, they couldn't even see the moon at night. They didn't know what was going on outside in the world. And of course, Maid Maleen couldn't see her hands, and she couldn't go down to the forest to be with him. She couldn't be with the deer darting through the glades and the little squirrels scampering about the forest floor, and she couldn't be with her nettles. Our Nettle princess was well and truly trapped. Now a long time passed, and our princess and her maid grew pale from lack of sunlight and nourishment. Sure enough, they had enough water and food to keep them going, but we need the sun. We need to be outside. One day, Maid Maleen woke up, and something felt different. Several years had passed, and it had always been dark for those years, but this morning it seemed to be that it was lighter. She looked around her, and she felt with her fingers around on the wall, and she realized that there was a tiny, tiny chink of light just showing through the mortar in the wall. I mean, it was tiny. It was like a pinhead kind of tiny bit of light. And through that tiny hole was growing a nettle. A little nettle plant. "Oh, little nettle friend," she said. "Oh, I am no longer alone with just my maid and our food and water and the darkness. You have come to join us." Oh, she was so happy because, of course, this little nettle meant hope. She wasn't now simply alone with one other, but the trees and the plants and the creatures she also felt connected to, and all because of this little nettle. "But what are we to do?" she said to the nettle. Her maid was still sleeping. "How on earth are we going to ever escape?" She sat for a while looking at the little nettle that had managed to burrow its way through the mortar in the wall. And she found that she had an idea. "Well now, little nettle," she said, "if you've managed to find your way through the mortar, then, well, why couldn't I?" She felt about for her bread knife. And when she had it in her hand, she put it against the mortar in the wall, and she started to scrape, just where the nettle was. And because several years had passed, and the mortar hadn't been particularly strong when it had been used to build the tower at first, it started to crumble away. And the hole got bigger and bigger and bigger. Maid Malene began to get excited, and she shook her maid awake, and she said, "Quick, now, use your fingernails, use anything sharp, use any other bit of rock. Here, use my bread knife as well. I'll find a piece of wood here and scrape away, but let us try now and work at the mortar." Oh, and they did. And they spent days and days, and their fingers and their nails were ripped and raw, and their knives were blunted, and the other bits of sharp stone and wood that they'd managed to find were all worn away. But do you know what? After several weeks, she made a hole big enough for them to crawl through, all by themselves and all inspired by this tiny nettle. They climbed through the hole, and they were free. It was a lot to adjust to the light when they first came out, because the sky was bright and they'd been in the darkness for several years now. And as they were trying to orientate themselves and work out what had happened, because everything seemed to have been laid to waste, and the castles up on the mountain looked like there were ruins and there was nobody about. But then there came a shout, and Malene and her maid looked around, and there was a soldier running towards them. There was nothing for it but to run as well. And which way did she run? She ran down the valley towards her forest. Oh, they had to run fast, because this knight seemed to be the only knight about, but he was shouting and yelling, and maybe others would come. And the two girls, they were running down the hill as fast as they possibly could, and they dived into the forest. And Malene saw a great patch of nettles. Now, that patch of nettles was the one that she used to sit beside, and she knew it was thick, and she knew that the knight wouldn't go anywhere near it, because everybody knew, of course, that a patch of nettles showed that the fairy folk were around there. There was some sort of fairy fae dwelling, and he would be too scared to go anywhere near it. So she grabbed her maid, and they both jumped into the nettles, knowing that they would get a little bit stung, but that it wouldn't matter. It would protect them from the night. They lay there as quiet as mice. The knight came barreling into the forest, and he looked about him, shouting still, "Where are you?" He said, "I saw you. I'll get such a prize for finding you and taking you back." But he couldn't see them, because, of course, the nettles were hiding them. And he didn't want to go wading through nettles to get stung. And anyway, as everybody knew, the tricksy fairy folk lived in the nettles. Nobody wanted to go in there. So before long, he left, and Maid Malene and her maid found themselves all alone in the forest. What to do? Where were they to go now? Both the castles on the mountains either side of the valley lay in ruins, and nobody was about. Where had everyone gone? Her father, the king, didn't seem to be here anymore. There was nothing to do but to walk. So they started to walk through the forest, and they were walking for a long, long time before they came, eventually, to another kingdom. Now, this kingdom seemed very similar to the one that Hans had come from. But of course, she'd been sure that she'd seen his castle lying in ruins on the opposite side of the valley to her old castle on the other mountain. But there was something about it. It just looked, well, like the kingdom that Hans had come from. It felt safe. So she went up to a big kitchen door. She hammered on it. When the door opened, she asked if her and her maid could possibly help in any way. Could they have some work? They asked. Well, the women in the kitchen and the great big chef said we could do with an extra pair of hands. So in they were brought, and immediately they were put to work. The thing was, Maid Malene wasn't great at working in the kitchen. She'd never learned to cook. In fact, she was pretty rubbish. And so they decided to find her another job. They decided to give her the job of lady's maid, and they sent her up to serve the princess in that castle. Now, when she arrived with that princess, it didn't take her very long to realise that this particular princess was nothing like her. In fact, she had quite an ugly nature. She was quite nasty. She shouted that she was bitter and sarcastic and horrible, and nothing that Maid Maleen could do ever seemed to be right. But of course, Maid Maleen could listen while she was put to work, and she soon found out that this girl, this ugly-natured princess here, was to be married, and in fact was to be married quite soon. The problem was that this princess didn't fancy walking herself to church. She was too proud to walk herself to church, and she was going to be married the very next day, apparently, and decided that she thought Maid Maleen ought to walk there for her. I mean, can you imagine it? Being so proud that you wouldn't even walk to your own wedding. She told Maid Maleen that she was going to dress her up in her wedding gear, and she was going to send her off to walk to the church, and that there she could be married to the man that she was going to spend the rest of her life with, this ugly-natured princess. And of course, Maid Maleen could come back and she'd put the dress on and go down to the wedding feast, and it would be as if she hadn't really made someone walk down there because she was too lazy to do it herself, but had been there at her own wedding, of course. Are you confused yet? This is the very confusing bit of the story. But Maid Maleen did put on that wedding dress because the ugly-natured princess was so horrible to her that there was nothing for it but to do exactly what she said. And Maid Maleen did go down to walk to church and be married with this prince. Here's the exciting bit. When Maid Maleen arrived to the outside bit of the church, she couldn't believe it. The prince that was waiting there to be married to this ugly-natured princess, the lazy one who was still back in her chamber up at the castle, was her very own Hans. He didn't realise, because Maid Maleen had a veil over her face. He couldn't see her face. And initially, Maid Maleen was heartbroken. Why would Hans choose to marry somebody else? But of course, you can listen into the gossip, can't you, of the people around you? And she realised Hans was being made to marry this princess. Hans believed her to be dead, locked up in that castle. Who would have survived anyway? Locked up in that horrible tower with no light. She went and stood next to Hans. And just as they began to walk into the church, she noticed a little patch of nettles down on the ground again. And she whispered to herself, well, half to herself, but also loudly enough for Hans to hear, "Oh, little Nettle, there you are, my friend. I am not the true bride." Hans turned to her and said, "Did you say something?" "No, my lord," she replied through her thick veil. "Did you say something about nettles?" Hans said. "No, my lord, no." And they began to walk. Now they walked over a footbridge that was in the middle of the churchyard. And Maid Maleen again looked down and said, "Thank you, little bridge," quietly to herself. "I'm not the true bride." But she was still feeling heartbroken that Hans really was marrying the ugly-natured princess back at the castle, even if it was her here in the dress and under the veil. "Did you say something?" Hans said. "No, my lord." "Oh, because I thought you spoke again, but no. Then they got to the church door, hammered on the church door for the door to be opened. And just one final time, Maid Maleen just whispered to herself one more time, "Oh, church door, thank you for letting us in, but I am not the true bride." Hans looked at her as if she'd said something. Of course she had again, but she just shook her head, and so they carried on. In they went and they were married. During the marriage ceremony, Hans put a necklace round her neck, just tucked up under the veil, and said, "Let this be a symbol of our love forever." But he didn't look very happy. Of course, he didn't know that this was Maid Maleen. He thought he was marrying the ugly-natured princess. Well, after the wedding, Maid Maleen was taken back to the castle, taken up to the tower room where the ugly-natured princess was. And so she ordered her straight away, "Take off that dress. I wish to put it on." I'm going to go down to the wedding feast now, and I'm going to eat all that lovely food, and then, oh, I've got to spend the rest of my life with that prince. There was nothing that Maid Meline could do apart from follow the orders. So that's what she did. Now, this ugly-natured princess went down to the wedding feast and sat beside her prince. Started to eat in a not very nice way. You know, you can kind of imagine it, sort of gobbling up her food and dribbling a bit and burping. The prince had something playing on his mind, and he turned to the ugly-natured princess and he said, "What did you say to that nettle on the way into church?" "What?" she said. "I don't speak to nettles." "Yes, you did," he said. You spoke to the nettle. I hang on a minute. I just need to go and see my maid." And she rushed out, and she rushed up to Maid Meline, and she said, "What did you say to the prince about nettles before you went in to be married?" "Nothing," she said. "I just said, 'Hello, little friend, I am not the true bride.'" Oh. The ugly-natured princess ran back downstairs, sat down at the wedding table again, and turned to Hans and said, "Oh, nothing. I was just talking to the nettle and greeted it as a friend." And then said, "I am not the true bride." "I beg your pardon," he said. "You are not the true bride? What? Oh, eat your food." Hans, now thoroughly confused, continued to eat his food. But then he said, because it was playing on his mind, "What did you say to the footbridge?" "The footbridge?" she said. "I don't talk to footbridges." "Yes, you did. You said something to the footbridge." "I said nothing of the sort." "And the door," he said. "You said something to the door. What did you say to the door?" "I said nothing of the sort." Still wearing the veil, of course, so we can't see which one really he's talking to either. Are you confused yet? I'm very confused. But anyway, the ugly-natured princess said, "Right, I'm going to rush back up to see my maid, because clearly something very strange is going on." She rushed up to Maid Meline and said, "What is it, girl, that you said to him about when you walked over the bridge and when you knocked on the church door? What did you say?" "Nothing," she said. "I just said, I'm not the true bride." "Oh," she said, "I'm going to have you for this." She ran back down the stairs, the ugly-natured princess, sat back down next to the prince and said, "I don't know, I just, I'm not the true bride." The prince stood up and said, "Something very funny is going on here," he said. "Remove your veil." "I will not," she said. "I will not remove my veil until this evening. We shall do things properly." "No," he said, "remove your veil." "I will not," said the ugly-natured princess. He said, "Right, fine," he said. "Then show me the necklace I gave you earlier." "What necklace?" she said. "The necklace that I gave you when we were wed." Well, of course, the ugly-natured princess wasn't wearing a necklace. And this was where it all started to unravel. Because the prince said, "You are not the woman I married in the church. Where is she?" "She is an imposter," said the evil, ugly-natured princess. "She locked me in my room, and then she insisted that she would walk to church and she would marry you. She is an imposter. Quick, guards, find her now. Find her, trap her, and put her in the castle dungeons, quickly, before she runs away." And Hans said, "No, no, you will not," he said. "I know exactly who it is. I know exactly. She spoke to the nettles. I know who it was." And of course, he ran out of that wedding feast hall, and he shot off down the hill, and he ran into the forest, and he kept running and running and running until eventually he found his way to the glade, the forest where he and Maid Meline had grown up, where they'd spent so many hours in with the squirrels scurrying and the light coming in great shafts through the canopy of trees and the deer darting in between the glades. And he waited. And it wasn't long before Maid Meline appeared herself. "My love, it is you," he said. "How on earth have you come here? What just happened?" And she told him the whole story. And he said, I was being made to marry that girl because I thought you were dead. I thought you'd been locked up in that castle and I'd lost you forever." No, she said, and she told him everything. And you know what they decided? They decided that they would stay in that forest, that they didn't need to go back to any castles, that nothing else that mattered was happening around them, that nothing else that was happening even mattered. They decided that that forest was their kingdom, and they lived there happily ever after, together forever. And that's the end of my story. Now, I think Kate's coming back on. Are you there, Kate?
I'm back on. Yeah, no, carry on what you said. That was a lovely story.
It's a funny old story because it's sort of I often get confused about why nettles would be talking, why people would be talking to bridges, why we'd be hammering on doors before we go into church, etc. But I think it's because it's such an old story, and there's lots of things that people would have done that were superstitious before they went into weddings. And of course, worn big veils over their faces, because I didn't wear one when I got married. I have one on my head that went down my back, not one that went over my face. So there's lots of scope for people getting very confused or being hidden or playing tricks on other people. So I quite like that story. But my favourite bit of that story has to be the heroine. And I'd say the heroine is the nettle, isn't it? It is.
I was going to say, it's got wonderful hope with that nettle weaving all the way through the story.
Yeah, who actually reminds Malene that she can do anything. You can escape from castles if you just start scratching at the mortar, like the nettles have managed to get in through tiny holes.
Yeah.
Now, Kate, before I go, I wanted to ask if there was anyone out there who fancied making some string. Now, you can make string out of lots of different things, trees and plants, not creatures so much. But for today, trees and plants. Now, this here is made out of bramble, but you can make string as well out of stinging nettles. And Kate's going to put a link up on Storytale, so people can go at doing this themselves. Now, what you need to do, I'll show you very briefly what you need to do just to prep, and then you can follow the link that Kate puts up there, which is done by the master, Ray Mears. So by the power of Ray, create your own nettle string. But by the power of Pridie, I can help you get started. Now, what I would suggest is that you find yourself some very big gloves. Now, these are my fire gloves, so they're leather gauntlets. You don't need to use these. These are just ones I found in the barn. But if you find yourself some ski gloves or some very, very thick gloves or 2 layers of gloves, that would even work very well. And what you need to do is you go and pick your nettles. Now, with your gloves on, you can pick your nettles and it won't matter. The tiny little needly sharp bits that are on them that kind of inject the acid into you that makes it sting, they won't go through your gloves. So you can get them like this and you can pull off their leaves. And what you're after is the stem bit here. Now, once you've got your long stems, and I would suggest pulling them up from the ground and making sure you've got some nice long thick stems that are about 1 metre long, what you then need to do is get yourself a big bit of wood like this, and you need to start bashing it with your stinging nettle in the middle of it. So here's my stinging nettle, and here's my bit of wood. So if you imagine, you need to start hammering it and bashing it. Now you hammer and bash it till you've squished up almost all of the stem, and you can pull off the leaves. When you've squished up that stem, what you'll find is that you can actually peel off the outside bit of it. You don't want the pithy inner. You can just peel off the outside bit of it that's pliable like this. And this is the stuff that you make into string. Okay? Now, what you need to do is you need to be really good at twisting. So what you do is you take your long bit of nettle now, that is basically the outside green bit of the stem that you've managed to bash and then peel off without stinging yourself, hopefully. What you need to do is if you fold it in half with one bit slightly longer than the other bit, Ray will explain to you why you need to do that, but that's basically so you can splice bits together and make a really long bit of string. And then you just need to start twisting it. Now, are you good at twisting string? Kate, can you twist things?
I can twist string, and I've got a 7-year-old who will be excellent at doing this, particularly the bashing bit that you did before. I think he'll love that.
It's great fun. And then you keep twisting like this until eventually it's sort of, when you put it close together, it will kind of want to curl up together on its. You actually end up with something that looks a bit like that, and you're holding it, this bit here, you see, where you're pinching it together. Now, this is the technical bit. I'm just looking in the camera screen to see whether you can see my nettle very well, but you basically need to twist the nettle away from yourself, and then you bring it back towards yourself and use the other bit of top string. So twist it away like that, and then bring it towards you. Now, basically, this can be very confusing to watch, and you'll probably need to watch Ray's videos several times before you get it clear in your mind. But what you'll notice here is that as I'm twisting it away and then towards myself, twisting it away and then towards myself, alternating between the two bits, look what I'm making. String.
String. Actually looks like string. Amazing.
Actually believe it. So you can have a go at doing that. And remember, But there's all sorts of amazing things that you can make with plants and trees outside. And when you do sit doing things like that, you really do feel like you're a bit better connected to them.
Yeah.
You might find that they send you some special messages. Don't eat anything without a grown-up somewhere near you or with you that knows
Yeah.
exactly what they're doing. Because remember, plants can be very dangerous. But the stinging nettle, well, you can make string out of it. And I might go and make myself another cup of tea with some young nettle leaves in a moment, and hopefully be feeling top of the mountain.
All those vitamins in it, exactly. Oh, well, thank you ever so much, Pridie, for a brilliant storytelling session. We love hearing your stories. And we do have, well, it's a very mini festival we have this year. We've already had 2 events already. We've got 3 more. We've got one this evening, which is aimed at adults who are interested in writing for children, with middle grade authors Emma Reed and Sophie Kirtley. And then we're back tomorrow for 2 more children's events, with Will Hamilton Davies in the morning at 10 and Alex Morse at 11. And the nature theme continues throughout the weekend. And we'll add all those links, with the Ray Mears links and the other links that Pridie's sent us. And it will also be on YouTube to rewatch at some time, the Nettle Princess and Pridie. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you, Kate. Take care. See you soon.
Thanks, Bye. Bye.